Hello my friends, Hank here, and welcome back to another episode of Up Close and Personal, the new series where we're exploring some of the most iconic military vehicles of the Second World War and beyond, like you've never seen them before. We're back here today at the Collings Foundation's American Heritage Museum, about an hour west of Boston, to learn all about this beautiful warbird behind me and how it became the last surviving airworthy military aircraft in the world that was at Pearl Harbor on that day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. Today, we're getting up close and personal with the Curtiss P-40B Tomahawk. All right, my friends, so we're over here in front of our Curtiss P-40B. I'm joined again today by Andrew and Matthew behind the camera over there to help take us through the history of this aircraft and the crazy true story that brought this vehicle to be here today. So Andrew, if you don't mind taking us through the legacy of this aircraft so the folks at home know just how unbelievably lucky we are to have this today.
Yeah. So this airplane carries bureau number 4113297. She's a P-40B, as we mentioned. She is one of 131 P-40Bs that were produced in Buffalo, New York by Curtiss Wright between 1940 and 1941. This one in particular was shipped off to the Army Air Corps in March of 41 and was delivered to Wheeler Field in Honolulu, Hawaii, come April of the same year. Okay. Upon getting to Honolulu, she was attached to the 19th Pursuit Squadron of the 18th Pursuit Group, where she spent several months. Come October of 41, she experienced a malfunction with her gear and was involved in a wheels-up landing. Overall, she sustained pretty minor damage, but it was enough to put her out of commission and into a maintenance hangar. While she was in that hangar, the fateful attack on Pearl Harbor happened via the Imperial Japanese Navy. Her being in the maintenance hangar saved her from the fate that 89 other airplanes at Wheeler Field would suffer on that day. Wheeler Field was a pretty prime target for the Japanese, seeing as we had a lot of planes there and they wanted to suppress our air power in defense of the harbor. So Wheeler Field was one of the first places attacked by the Japanese on December 7th. She was restored to airworthy status, and in January of 1942, while on a routine training flight over Honolulu, she experienced a unrecoverable spin, where she then crashed into a mountainside. Unfortunately, her pilot, Lieutenant Kenneth Sprankle, was killed in the crash. His body was recovered shortly after, but the airplane was deemed too difficult to remove and not worthy of recovery at the time. The wreckage was rediscovered in 1985, and then parts of the airframe were recovered the same year, with the rest of the airplane being recovered come 1989. In 89, the Curtiss Wright Historical Association was founded, and they began a full-scale restoration effort on the airplane. So using primarily parts from the original plane with some supplementary parts from two other airframes that also crashed, they brought her back to airworthy status. And thanks to a very generous donor, we have the honor and privilege of displaying her here at the museum today.
Wow. Just any piece of that is just mind-boggling. Yeah. But just to think that this, through this crazy twist of fate and this accident prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, that's what ends up saving this in the first place. There's a fair chance this would have been sitting out on Wheeler Field during the attack and destroyed with, again, most of those other aircraft. And then this tragic accident with Lieutenant Sprankle there is what somehow preserved this to where it is today. It's just unbelievable to think that this sat on a mountainside for, 40-odd years. And now it's sitting here and is airworthy today. So with that said, I know, the P-40, when I think of it, and I think a lot of military history enthusiasts think of this vehicle, it's kind of this iconic early American and early Allied symbol of air power, but sometimes it gets overshadowed by these vehicles that come later, the P-47 or P-51. But this paves the way for a lot of what comes down the road. So if it's all right with you, let's take a spin around and try and look at some of the features of this aircraft that make this so special, and hopefully we can go home and I can try and build one of these up down in 1/48 scale.
Absolutely.
Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right, friends, so we've switched sides. We're over here on the other side of the fuselage here. And Andrew, if you don't mind taking us a little bit through just the history of the P-40, because this is an aircraft that goes through many, many variants throughout the course of the war. This is B, as we've said a few times, one of the early ones. But tell us a little bit about the evolution of the Tomahawk or the Warhawk.
Yeah, so starting out, the P-40 was based off the Curtiss P-36 Hawk. It's essentially the same rear end of the plane. They just swapped out the old radial engine and threw in an inline Allison V1710. Now, the downside with this engine is it does not have a two-stage supercharger, which meaning that anywhere upwards of 20,000 feet or so, you start to really suffer.
Interesting.
especially things, speed, maneuverability, important stuff for a fighter plane. So way later variants would use things like the Merlin engine, which did have a 2-stage supercharger, much better engine, better performance.
Sure.
But all these early versions used the Allison.
Okay.
This is the same style of plane. The B model is the same style that was sent to the first American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers over in China. So these are often seen depicted with a shark's mouth because that was kind of their thing.
Yeah.
So that's become an iconic image of World War II aviation in general.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, it's built for that.
She's built to take a shark's mouth.
I know.
Overall, the P-40 as a whole would have more than 13,700 units produced over several variants, spanning from the early Bs and Cs down to the Ms and the N models. The entire airframe would go through all sorts of changes. The tail sections would thin out a bit, the wings changed a bit, armament changed. The B models, the early version like this, had 250 cals in the nose, and then 430 cals, total in the wings.
Sure.
2 in either wing. It was later found that 30 cal was just not sufficient. As we found with most planes.
It's amazing, to think that by the end of the war you've got 8 on the P-47 at least, just dripping in 50 cals, and this is relatively light. But at the time, I mean, considering I guess what they expected this to go up against, that's pretty adequate armament.
This
right?
was enough, and aircraft used by even the Japanese at the time weren't super heavily armored.
Sure.
So 250 cals was usually enough, and this was also used for a lot of ground attack work. There were bomb mounts that could be put on here. You could put fragmentation bombs, regular high explosive general purpose bombs. So they did see a lot of use as ground attack aircraft as well, which the 50 cals are really good for. Targets like trucks, bunkers, soft targets, things like that. They're very effective against things like that. And the plane did perform exceptionally well at low altitudes. Had an incredible turn rate. Topped out around 350 miles an hour or so with these early versions, which was the fastest at the time, really.
Wow.
Obviously, it became obsolete come later aircraft.
Sure.
You look at planes like the P-38 and the F-6F that tops out at 390. Sometimes
unbelievable,
upwards, Corsair goes upwards of 400.
Paves the way for a lot of what's to come, though.
Yes, very much so.
It's unbelievable. I kind of take for granted. I didn't realize how long the production run was and how many variants go through this. I mean, I feel like a lot of times you hear about, Mustangs and Thunderbolts. It's just through the D model. I guess later with the Thunderbolt goes a little bit deeper than that, but all the way to the ends and stuff with this is wild.
Yeah, they would see service right through to the end of World War II.
No kidding.
The reason they don't tend to get as much media coverage and time seen in movies and TV and stuff is because they didn't serve as much in the European campaigns.
Right.
These would see a lot of service in China, the Mediterranean, Africa. The British were some of the first to field the P-40 in Africa, where it excelled at low altitudes. But once you got up to those higher altitudes, it couldn't compete with things like the BF-109 and the FW-190,
no kidding.
Lacking that supercharger.
Sure. And on that note, so this was obviously a huge Lend-Lease vehicle to all of our allies. And this, I think, kind of plays in, we were talking about this a little bit before we started filming here, but it's a vehicle of many, many names. You hear the Warhawk, you hear the Tomahawk, the Kitty Hawk. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the Tomahawk name refers to any airplane, any P-40 from the P-40 base model.
The base,
up through to the C model.
So those first few,
Yes. That was really only used by the British, primarily at least. Any models from the D and later, the British called them Kitty Hawks. The British really had a thing for naming our aircraft. Even if it was an American plane going over to them. You look at airplanes like the Mustang and the Thunderbolt, we only have those names because the British gave them to them. But as far as the U.S. was concerned, this was the P-40 Warhawk.
Just a catch-all for all of them.
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Essentially, the thinking behind that being it came from the Hawk. This was designed specifically for World War II.
Hence the Warhawk. So. Pretty simple math there. All right.
Yeah.
All right, gang, so we're over here on the side of the fuselage. We could start out with the meatball, the famous meatball.
Tell us a little bit about this.
So it became fairly standardized as the American aircraft insignia come around 1918 or so, and stayed that way right up through until 1941.
Yep.
Wherein we found that, seeing as one of our sworn enemies was the Imperial Japanese, and their flag happens to be a big white flag with a big red circle, this probably wasn't a great idea given friendly fire incidents.
Up here, close, obvious. When you're,
you're
hundreds of yards away, not so much.
Yeah. So we transitioned from this to the newer star and bar style, which we still use a variant of today.
Right.
It was just a very simple keeping essentially just remove the red and add some bars to the side, and that's your new insignia. And that solved the friendly fire issue.
And it kind of a quick way nowadays, a quick way to kind of date schemes on these aircraft, right? I love the meatball personally, but nostalgic little bit there. But kind of a blast to the past. But you were just showing me before we started rolling here, we've got a little surprise.
Yes, so we have an access door here. This just uses standard aircraft screws that are keyed in. Pushing this in releases the lock, and in here,
would you look at that?
You have, number one, a case for maps and the sort. You have a radio set back in here, as well as access to a whole bunch of other important things. You have your starter crank up top for hand starting the airplane.
Wow, yep.
And you can see right through up to the cockpit through here. So in here you have access to all your control cables, because of course these were manually controlled control surfaces. So all your wiring and your control wires are in there, so that's one way to get at them.
No kidding.
Another thing worth noting while we're here too is we can see the end of the wing. These wing sections are completely disconnected from the fuselage when they're produced.
Okay.
So they would be shipped off to whatever airfield they were going to take off out of as the fuselage unit and the wings.
Well, good for shipping purposes, I suppose.
Yes. So once they got to the airfield, they just screwed them together.
Literally
and
just
hooked up some controls, and they were able to take off with them. So it is really neat, and something that you'll see too when building the model is it's probably done in a similar way to this, where the wings are disconnected. So it's not all that different from the way they actually go together, which I think is kind of neat.
And they're literally just little screws.
They're just screwed together.
That's it. Well, I'm sure there's more inside, obviously.
There's wing struts inside.
That's
and
incredible,
other things that
though.
connect it. But on the outside, it's just little flathead screws, which is hilarious.
Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I suppose, right?
Wow.
All right, friends, so we're down here hiding in the back half of the plane to talk about an interesting little detail here. There is a hole going all the way through the fuselage of the aircraft.
Yes.
Why?
So this is marked out as a lift and tie down hole. Obviously, it's used for lifting and tying down the airplane.
That would do it.
Winds have a thing of picking up airplanes, especially when sitting on a big open airfield. So this can be used to run a rope through and tie the airplane down to the ground. Otherwise, it can be used to lift the tail of the airplane. If you have about 4 people, the plane's light enough that you can put a rod through, have 2 people on either side, and lift the tail to taxi the plane around.
You just muscle it around. No kidding. Wow.
Yeah, a lot of tail dragger style planes use something like this. Some of the really light planes just have a handle on the bottom. Planes like the L4 Grasshopper and L5 Sentinel do that. But heavier stuff like this, you just have a steel rod that you put through the plane and you can lift it.
That'll do. Well, we'll have to take a peek for that when we build the kit. If there is actually a full hole going all the way through, we'll see. While we're down here, I guess we might as well talk a little bit about the tail wheel.
Yeah.
This is a fully retracting tail wheel on the P-40? Oh, no kidding, huh?
Yeah. Another neat little detail, too, is we do have a canvas covering kind of sealing off the wheel well when when the doors are open. But yeah, the wheel does fully retract, and the gear doors seal up the bottom of the plane completely, unlike planes like the Spitfire, for instance, that just have a tail wheel hanging out there.
There you go. Might as well, right? If you got the ability to retract in there, save yourself a little bit of drag.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Wow. All right, so we're over here on the side of the wing here to talk a little bit about our control surfaces. So, Andrew, if you don't mind running us through what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so more than half of the 37-foot wingspan is flaps. More than half of each wing is flap on the B model. She only breaks down in here at the center line and runs all the way up to the aileron. So you have a lot of drag that you can utilize there. Moving over to the aileron, it is canvas covered, as most World War II era fighters were. You don't start to see metal covered control surfaces until much later, 50s, 60s.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, obviously we have our trim tabs in there, as well as some inspection doors, another insignia there, and yeah, the wings are fairly simple overall. Got our anti-skid coating over here, which is essentially just sand thrown at wet paint to keep you from slipping off the airplane.
Simple as that. Yep.
Yeah. So, anyhow, speaking of the anti-skid, why don't we move up the cockpit?
Let's do it. All right. Okay, so we are up here on the wing route now to check out the cockpit of this beautiful bird. First of all, unbelievable looking in here. It's simple, but it's complex at the same time. I'll never claim to be a pilot by any means, but Andrew, take us through what we're looking at inside here a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so overall we have pretty basic controls.
Sure.
It aligns perfectly with something early war. They're designed prior to World War II. Overall, fairly simple dashboard, only the needed controls and instruments.
Yep.
Airspeed indicator up here. Let's see. Got your turn and bank indicator over here. Artificial horizon. That's gyroscope fed, so that goes off your vacuum system.
Okay.
Magneto switch over there. Fuel selector valve over there. Radio controls and electrical controls down below. Throttle quadrant over on your left.
Yep.
Trim controls over here. Obviously, you've got your main control stick.
Wow. These are manual charging handles for the 50s?
Yes.
Wow,
So
that's
those,
wild.
Yeah, the nose-mounted 50s are manually charged.
Yep.
You have your other charging handles down below there for charging the wing guns.
These are for the 30s, okay. Yep. Wow.
But yeah, overall, very simple.
Yeah.
Especially compared to some of even the later warfighters.
Sure.
That start getting up in complexity. When you have things like superchargers and, especially the Navy planes tend to have a lot when you have wing folding controls and all this stuff.
Gets busy in here.
Yeah.
No kidding. Well, lots of beautiful zinc chromate in here,
Indeed.
so
Yes.
got to pay attention to that. No excuses for screwing up the cockpit when we try and build this thing. Now that we're actually in here, trying to see what else we got in here. Our gear controls down there hiding on my side.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
No kidding. And then this is our
So this
canopy
is your canopy control, so that's just on a wire.
Oh, it's just like an old school
Just a crank.
window roll, yeah.
Yep.
No kidding, huh? And then up here, we've got a pretty substantial. Is this our armored windscreen plate here?
Yep, that's your armored glass. Gun sight would be mounted just in front of that.
Okay.
Back here, the seat is just your standard aluminum seat. The reason it has no padding or anything is because it's designed to be paired with a seat parachute.
That you're sitting on top of. Okay.
Right, which would add about 6 to 8 inches under your seat. But yeah,
No kidding. Yeah.
standard harness, big cushy leather.
I was going to say, take a nap in here. It's a nice.
Yep.
No, not exactly, but wow.
Yeah. So hey, you want to hop in? Fill it out?
Let's do it if I can. That'd be
Awesome.
great.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so let's see if I can get into this beautiful bird. Oh my goodness. I've never done this before. This is pretty unbelievable though, guys. Okay. Slide myself in here nice and easy. Oh, okay. And we gotta do the whole deal if we're gonna do it. Oh my goodness. Wow. That's freaky being in here. Oh. It's unbelievable though. I mean, it's a comfortable cockpit. Obviously, you said it'd be sitting on a little more oomph here, so you could see over the nose a bit better. But this was cutting edge for a long time. It's hard to imagine. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine, I guess. Looking at this now, I don't know anything about flying other than the basics, but it's complicated in here, and it's all old school stuff. Jeez. It's also just hard to imagine that, Lieutenant Sprinkle there lost his life in this cockpit, more or less, which is heavy, but unbelievable opportunity to be in here. Thank you very much. Wow. Can I close the
Yeah, go for it.
shut this down here just to see?
Let's swing out of it.
That's open. All right, so we're using our old school window rolls here. Button that up. No kidding. Wow. That's that. Huh. That's beautiful. Jeez. Huh. Yeah, that's not something you do every day. Wow. Thank you. Jeez. All right, my friends. So that's been our little walk around of this P-40B. Andrew, thank you very much for helping us out with this again. It's, again, unbelievable treat to be able to look at this aircraft and for you guys to have this here so close to home and let people come in here and get as up close and personal to this history as possible. I did do that on purpose. You know, if you guys, I said before in our last video, if you have a chance or make yourself have a chance, pop over and check out these guys' channels on YouTube and everywhere that videos are videos. They have some incredible content walking through a lot of the, you know, unique, incredible equipment in this museum. I'm going to go home and try and build this beauty up in 1/48 scale. But until next time, thanks again, and we'll see you guys next time. Be well, happy building. Cheers.